Persia. All right, so somehow, there's this stirring by God in the heart of the king of Persia, and he is going to say, time for you to go back. Now, one of the guys who is going to lead the people from Babylon back to, Jerusalem is going to be this fellow by the name of Ezra. There are essentially three main leaders, and there are three waves of people who return back to Jerusalem. Anybody remember the first one? Ezra's actually not the first one. He does lead, and he's part of the first wave, but he doesn't really start to lead the people until he actually gets there. Nehemiah comes later. Nehemiah is, here's a report that the people who have returned, man, they're not doing so good. So hearing that report, he's kind of pricked in his heart, and he goes to the king who he's serving and says, look, I need to go back and be with my people. And then he comes back and begins leadership. And it's under Nehemiah that they really start to prosper and get the building done. The first one is a guy by the name of Zerubbabel. You remember Zerubbabel? Zerubbabel, some people say. But it's a weird name. Zerubbabel sounds like something off of the Flintstones, right? Anyhow, Zerubbabel, that's his name, and he was part of, the leadership. And then you have Ezra. Those are the three main leaders in the return from the Babylonian captivity. So the period of judges is over. The period of kings is over. The people have received that ultimate punishment by God. Of being taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Of course, that's the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was taken captive by what nation? You remember? The Assyrians. Yeah, the Assyrians. And of course, most of them are never really going to, return. But this is all taking place after that time. They're finally coming back, and they're finally going to rebuild. Now, to put it kind of in a spiritual perspective, why did they go into captivity? Because, they sinned. God had blessed them with, the land. God had blessed them with not having to build the houses, fighting for them in war, and so on and so forth. So many ways, many of them miraculous ways. And they still turned their back on it. Left the temple left the temple in ruins, shut down worship, never did celebrate the year of Jubilee, as far as we can tell. The Sabbaths were shut down, no feast, no Passover, none of those things were happening. None of those things were happening, and instead they built high places. And anytime you hear, the Old Testament, especially in the book of Kings, where they talk about the high places or the wooded places, some versions, say, or the groves. Anytime those words are used, it's talking about places of worship that are built for false gods. Okay? But, some places will say that he was a pretty good king, but he did not tear down the high places. Those were places where they worshiped, other, or false, I should say, gods. So they sinned. And God had warned them. That's what the prophets were all about. That's why he sent prophets, right? I mean, prophets weren't just guys who were there to, stand on the corner and yell and, give people something to laugh at. They were there trying to give the people God's message. And time again. I mean, they just simply would not listen. So God said, okay, I'm done. You're going into captivity. Now, there are several books that are kind of relevant or contemporary to this. For instance, the book of Daniel is written at the beginning and goes through the period of the captivity. Now, we're never told anything about Daniel returning, but we are told that about Daniel's life through a decent portion of the Babylonian captivity. All right, and likewise his friends, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. There are books that are contemporary, obviously Jeremiah, but here we have the story of Ezra, and Ezra is leading this return. The biggest thing about Ezra, or the book of Ezra, and where we find Christ, is actually found in the character of the character of the rebuilder of the temple, that fellow by the name of Zerubbabel. And if you go over to chapter 4, go over to chapter 4 and you begin reading here a little bit. It says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the return of exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the father's house, and he said to them, 'Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here.' But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads, the fathers' houses of Israel, said to them, 'You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. But we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, the king, as King Cyrus, king of Persia, has commanded us.' Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia, and the reign of Ahasuerus. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem." So the story goes like this. Zerubbabel wants to rebuild the temple, and they start to rebuild the temple, and these folks come over. Now these folks are going to later become known as the Samaritans. Okay, the Samaritans, which they were considered a half-breed people. They were people who were taken out, or people who actually were taken from another place and were brought into the land of Israel or Jerusalem, and they settled there. And when they settled there, they just kind of picked up some of the portions of the teaching of the Jewish people, and they practiced some of those things. Very different practice than the Jews would have practiced, but nonetheless, it did bear a similarity to it. Right? It's kind of like Islam claims to worship the same God. It's kind of the same same type of thing. There are some similarities, but there are some major differences as well. So they come and they say, "We want to build with you." And Zerubbabel says, no, you're not going to build with us. And so the people wage almost like a marketing campaign against them. They go out and they just have this large campaign of the folks that are surrounding them to just discourage the people. Now, you don't want to build. Why do you want to build that temple? And so they really discouraged, the people from actually building the temple. And then eventually a letter is sent to Artaxerxes, who is, the king. And of course, the king orders the work to cease. Near the end of the chapter, the king said to Rehum, the commander of the Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of the associates who live in Samaria, and the rest of the princes beyond the river, "And now the letter that you sent, plainly read before me, I made a decree, and search has been made, and it has been found that the city from the old has risen against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been made in it." And essentially it goes on to argue, look, why would we want to rebuild this city and this temple when these people have a history of being rebellious and rising up against powers that come against them? I mean, they waged war against the Philistines, they waged war against the Amorites and the Moabites, and all these things. So we're looking at the records here and we're thinking, these people don't have a really good record. So are we just going to rebuild their city only to have them wage war against us? So it's a legitimate concern. But Zerubbabel pushes through it, and eventually over in chapter 5, you're introduced to a couple of guys whose names you'll recognize. "Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. And Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them." All right, so they begin to rebuild again. But it only gets done by the leadership of this fellow Zerubbabel. And now most Bible scholars see the picture of Jesus in this, the rebuilder of the temple, which of course the temple, if you go over to the New Testament and you look at books like Corinthians, which we've been looking at on Sunday mornings, the church is referred to as the temple. The church is referred to as the temple. You go through this period where these people come back from captivity, and then, they're not back after captivity very long, and they're once again moving away from God. And then we have this 400-year period of silence where things just seem to kind of get worse, to the point where Isaiah himself, near the end of his letter, says, predicting Christ coming, would say he's going to grow up like a root out of dry ground. This spiritual dryness is going to be pervasive across the land. And that's what the first century is like. That's the century in which Christ was born. And that's the century in which he would, grow up. The temple was there standing. The physical temple was there standing. But there was no genuine faith there. There was no spiritual structure there. Christ's greatest, maybe not greatest, let's say most scathing remarks and his toughest rebukes are for the people who are running the temple. You brood of vipers, hypocrites, woe unto you. He pronounces woe after woe after woe upon the leadership of the people who's in the temple. It may be physically there, but spiritually it's in ruins. It's in ruins. And Christ came back to rebuild it. Now, he could care less about the bricks and mortar. He built a temple upon the cornerstone that he was. Okay? Other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Christ, right? So we build upon that foundation, Paul says to the letter in Corinthians. And he says, for we are the temple of God. We are the temple of God. So here, Zerubbabel, and being the builder of the temple, is kind of a foreshadowing of Christ being the builder of the temple in the New Testament. But that's Ezra. We got Nehemiah too. Go over to the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah's story is kind of the same way. He too was a builder, but in the case with Nehemiah. He was the builder of the walls, right? Zerubbabel was the one who helped get the temple rebuilt. Nehemiah is the one who came, and the walls were just a mess. Armies come, go. You remember this is the story that you're told when you're a little kid, how they had tools in one hand and a sword in the other hand, because armies were constantly coming against them, because they had no walls, no protection, right? They were insecure. So Nehemiah comes back, and Nehemiah's story is similar to Ezra's story. He's sent back by a king. He's sent with supplies, comes back, surveys the land, and he gives that call that just about any sermon you ever hear about building or growing the church will include this verse. Let us arise and build, right? So that was the call for Nehemiah, and they did. And they rebuilt the entire wall around Jerusalem. Anybody remember how many days? I know you were not prepared for it, but... What? 52? Is it 52? I thought it was just 50. But you may be right. I'll get there. 52 days, yeah. I just saw myself, 52 days. Yeah. So that's not very long. That's like a month, close to 2 months. Not quite there. But, it's a big wall. We're not talking about, we're talking about a wall that's designed to keep armies out. So this is probably at least a 12, 14-foot wall, if not higher. And it's not going to be some piddly little thing. it's going to be somewhat that, it's going to be something that's substantial, because that's how these people mark their property. But anyhow, so Nehemiah comes in and he tells them, let us rise and build. And the people do build, and they find success in that, or security. And so again, with Nehemiah, we have the prefiguring of Christ in this idea of security. Christ is our protection. He is our spiritual guardian. I mean, he's the one that is being referenced when it comes to, for instance, things like the shepherd song. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Time and time again, where we're told about how Christ is the one who gives us the security, and ultimately, it's the eternal security that we are concerned with. And perhaps the best place to go to talk about that is over in the book of 1 John, where John says time and time again, about 27 times, that there are many things that we can know and know most assuredly. And one of those is that we have the salvation of God through, Christ. We can know that that is the case. That's a powerful thing. But Nehemiah, or the figure of Nehemiah, it just typifies that. The story of Esther. Let's try to get Esther done. What's the story? How's the story of Esther go? Just kind of a summary, a recap. No? Well, yeah, I mean, she was faithful to God, right?
She finally ends up with the king. So she had his ear for the things that were going on, and so she told him that there was a plan to destroy the Jews. So he kind of helped her out there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting story, and that's a pretty good summary. There are kind of two things that are happening at the same time. One is, the relationship between the king and the two women that are mentioned in the book. The first one is Vashti, who seems like a pretty together woman. The king calls for her, come and parade yourself in front of us. And if you read a lot of the commentators, they'll tell you that the way things are kind of worded and maybe based on historical things, they were wanting her to do more than just come in and twirl her dress around. It was more of a come in and parade yourself unclothed in front of us type of thing. So she said, nope, not going to do that. And then the guys get upset and say, well, hey, wait a minute. The king's wife stood up to him and said, no. I mean, if this catches on, every wife in the kingdom is going to start telling her husband no. And then what will become of, it's this real, I don't know. I laugh every time I kind of read that part, because it's kind of like, it's just sort of weird. Every guy in the kingdom is afraid that his wife is going to tell him no. I don't know, man. It just seems strange. But that's what happens. And the king says, all right, we'll take care of it. She's gone, sent to exile, and then one of the leaders for the king says, hey, look, why don't we have a beauty pageant? We'll have a beauty pageant. So they have a beauty pageant, and one of the contestants is Esther. And Esther apparently is a beautiful young lady, and she ends up being chosen. Now, at the same time that all of that story is happening, you have her cousin. Now, some folks say her uncle, probably more likely a cousin, who is one of the older gentlemen in the community, and he sits at the gate and he, gives wisdom. He's kind of a leader of the Jews, leader of the Jews during difficult times. They're living under, the Persians, right? The Babylonians are gone. The Persians are now ruling. This is before the return from exile. It's difficult times, but, the Jews still have their identity, and it's because of guys like Mordecai who, maintain that identity, that they still actually have it. Is that right? I don't think that's right. Okay, so it's because of him, and people like him, they have that identity. Well, there's a guy who's like the number two to the king. His name is Haman. And, for various reasons, mainly because of his own pride, but certainly because Mordecai provoked him by not bowing down to him, Haman hates Mordecai. Absolutely hates him. And he, of course, has the king's ear, and he does everything. I mean, he finds out that Mordecai doesn't bow down before him, and it's just, he becomes obsessive. I not only want to kill that guy, I want to kill all of his people. So he gets the king's ear, and he starts to write these decrees about, the extermination of the Jews at the hand of, people, at the hand of those, people. And what he doesn't know is that Esther's a Jew. He doesn't know that. And Esther uses her, stunning looks and seemingly very kind and amicable ways with the king. And at the end of the story, kind of lays it all out there. And it ends up ending Haman's life. Haman thinks, man, I can't wait for that day to come when we can kill Jews. And he's already building a gallows that's like huge. I mean, if you look at the proportions of this thing, it's like 70 foot in the air. He's building this thing, and man, he can't wait for the day he gets to hang Mordecai. And he ends up hanging on his own gallows because, well, somewhat by accident. He ends up laying across the queen's bed when the king walks in. And that can never be a good situation. So he ends up losing, his life. So this is the story of Esther. So what exactly, or where exactly does Christ appear in here? Now, on your paper, it mentions that, he can be seen, or he's typified by the person of, Mordecai. And I guess you can make that argument. And it's perfectly reasonable to do so. I mean, Mordecai was a guy who, he's the one that convinced Esther. If you don't step up, Esther, and do what is right for your people, then make no mistake about it. God will make sure that it happens. Deliverance will come from somewhere else, though you may lose your life. And then he says that famous line, that I want to talk a little bit more about. Who knows, but God has sent you for such a time as this, right? In other words, God is the one that is controlling, all of this. And to me, this is the part that really, really speaks to Christ, because this is one of the main things about Jesus that we have to know. He being the central character of the Bible, everything in the Old Testament literally points toward him. The captivity of God's people, the captivity of the people, the putting of them in the land, the holding of them in Egypt, and the rise of guys like Moses and the prophets, and all of those things just work out in such a way that they point to, and they create the window of opportunity for Christ to come into the world. It's all providential working of God. And then, of course, everything that comes after him points back, to him. So to me, it's not really the person per se, even though, again, you could argue that, Mordecai delivered his people by, encouraging, Esther to be that mouthpiece and make sure that her people were represented. I think the bigger point is the providence of God. And there is nothing more providential in this whole plan of God. There's nothing more central to the providential working of God than the sending of Jesus Christ into this world, to die for our sins. Because everything else just kind of radiates from it. You know, I mean, all of the prophecies, you know, all of the things that we find in the Old Testament, why people were in certain places at certain times for, you know, such a time as this. You know, it's why, you know, Ruth finds herself in the field of Boaz, and why the nearer kinsman gives up his rights. And, you know, you find all of these things just working out so that Christ will come onto the scene in that first century like a root out of dry ground. So to me, the central message is the providence of God, the working of God, and that speaks directly to Christ. All right, we've got 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do another one. Job. All right. Well, Job's an interesting book. Who wants to tell the story of Job? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a very good summary. If you didn't hear him, he basically said, you know, Satan and God had this conversation. God's, hey, have you considered my servant Job? And he only serves you because you're protecting him. You put a hedge around him. You remove the hedge and let me touch him. We'll see how long he serves you. He's going to curse you instead. Doesn't do that. So they have a second conversation where basically God gives him the permission to do everything you want. Just don't kill him. Is basically it. You know, don't kill him. And of course, we know how it goes. I mean, just you look at everything that Job loses. He loses all his kids in one day. You know, a tornado comes and wipes them out while they're at the house. He wipes out the crops. He wipes out the cattle. Wipes out the businesses that he has. On top of that, his wife comes to him, basically says, Job, you're useless, curse God and die. He is stricken with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He's reduced at one point to going to what we would call the city dump. And he's in there with a broken piece of glass scraping his boils. Okay. So we'll pick up with Job later. That's okay. All right, we'll just start there next time, guys. In the book of Job, interesting. If you want to read some about it, if you're interested in reading Job, by the way, oldest written book in the Bible, most likely. Just read the first few chapters. You don't have to go through all of it. First few chapters, it'll give you kind of the insight that you need.
So I've spent most of my life in the arms of another man's wife. Just seeing if you guys are paying attention from Sunday. I got laughs. It was my mom if you weren't here as a joke. The topic tonight that I'm speaking from is Hebrews 13:5. I will never leave you nor forsake you. The part I'm going to focus on is never leaving you. If you have kids, I'm sure you're aware kids do not like to be left alone. Mine scream their heads off whenever Crystal leaves. It's just inherent. We don't like to be left alone. And all throughout the Bible we read about how it's not good to be left alone. In Ecclesiastes, the 4th chapter, the preacher talks about being left alone and how having a companion is better. 4:9 and following, he says, 2 are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. And later, he asks rhetorically about how one person will keep warm by himself. And then he explains how if there's a fight, one man can prevail against another, but one can't prevail against two. And Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, tells him that he can't go at it alone. In Exodus 18:18, Jethro tells Moses, what you are doing is no good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. And all the way at the beginning of man, God looked at Adam, and what did he say, church? I think we need to restudy that. He says, it's not good for man to be alone. Y'all remember the joke, but you can't remember that. So God made him a helper. And Jesus, speaking to his followers in the book of John, told him that he will be deserted by people, but that God will never desert him. The Father is with me, he says. John 16:32. And over in 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul tells the Corinth church, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So I'm sure you guys are probably wondering where I'm going with this. About a year ago, I started wearing this bracelet as support for Uncle Tim. And it says on it, no one fights alone. And a few weeks ago, Crystal asked me, as Tim's treatments were wrapping up, am I going to get rid of it? And I said, nope, I think I'll wear it till it falls off. It's a daily reminder to me that no one fights alone, that I'm not alone, that this fight that I'm in is not mine to fight alone. I'm blessed by all the family that's in this room. All of us are. Over the years, I've said prayers for people I have no idea who they are, but you guys have brought their prayers before us and their names. But I realize not everybody has a luxury of 100-plus extended family like we do. And I've made a conscious effort to start reaching out to people I know just to see if they need any help in this walk. And tonight I offer you guys both an invitation and a challenge. The invitation is as if you have any needs, bring it before your family here. We'll certainly help you where we can. But my challenge is to start looking for opportunities to show others that they are not alone. Amen. Let Tim be the example that prayers do work. And if each one of us can pick one person to help, that's 100 people that will know God's love that might not know it today. Like Paul told us, let's be imitators of him as he is of Christ. Let's not let anyone walk alone. If you have any needs tonight, please come forward as we stand and sing.